Hello there, and welcome. This is the place where curiosity curls up beside wonder, and questions drift like quiet clouds through the night. Tonight, we're taking a slow walk into something older than history, into the twilight of memory itself. So go ahead, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights or pull your blanket a little closer, because what we're about to explore stretches far beyond pyramids and scrolls, beyond kings and calendars, back to a time when the world was still wild, and stories were how we remembered who we were. Let me ask you something before we begin. When you were a kid, did you ever hear a story that felt different? Not just make-believe, but something that made your imagination feel like it had brushed against an ancient truth? Maybe it was a story about a great flood, or shining visitors from the sky, or a golden age when humans spoke to the stars. Think about that story for a second. What if it wasn't just a myth? What if it was a memory? If you find peace in these quiet explorations, these gentle dives into mystery, please consider liking this video or subscribing to this little corner of curiosity. It helps us find others who think like you do, people who find calm in wondering. Now take a breath. Let's begin. We're heading into that hazy border between archaeology and dream, where history starts to blur into myth, and myth might just be history seen through the fog of forgetting. Because tonight, we're asking one of the oldest questions humanity has ever whispered into the dark. What if the ancient myths weren't fiction, but memories of a civilization that existed long before everything we know? Humans have always told stories, long before we carved words into stone or pressed ink into papyrus. We had our voices, we had firelight, we had the stars. Those early storytellers weren't authors, they were rememberers. When they spoke of gods descending from the clouds or of cities swallowed by the sea, they might not have been inventing. They might have been passing something on. Details shifted with each retelling, but the core, the rhythm, the pulse stayed the same. That's the strange thing about myth. Underneath all the exaggerations, it carries something that feels solid. A fossil pressed into story, across continents that never touched, among cultures that never met, the same echoes appear. Worlds ending in floods, beings descending from the heavens to teach humanity how to build, plant, measure, golden ages rising and then collapsing, fire from the sky, oceans swallowing cities whole. Coincidence? Maybe. Archetypes of the human mind? Possibly. But sometimes, the similarities feel too precise. When myths from Sumer, Mesoamerica, and Southeast Asia all describe the earth drowning after a sudden catastrophe, it makes you wonder. Were our ancestors just imaginative storytellers, or were they remembering something real? Archaeologists often talk about the great silence before written history, a kind of cultural amnesia. Writing is only about 5,000 years old farming, maybe 12,000, but before that, tens of thousands of years of human life, largely unrecorded. Yet silence isn't the same as nothing those people built. They carved, they dreamed. Some of what they made still survives, weathered and half buried. At Göbekli Tepe, older than the pyramids, stone circles align with the stars so precisely, it's hard to believe it was all coincidence. Other traces have vanished completely, washed away by floods, buried under ice, erased by time. So what if, hidden somewhere in that forgotten stretch of prehistory, there was a civilization advanced enough to seed myths that would echo through millennia? Not advanced like us, with metal and machines, but advanced in ways that wove knowledge, astronomy, and architecture together with story and spirit, a people whose memory survived only as legend. It's an eerie thought, isn't it? That maybe we're not the first to look at the stars and wonder if we once knew them better, that the tales of Atlantis, of Lemuria, of gods walking among humans might not be inventions at all, but the last shimmering reflections of something our species once lived through and could never quite forget. When Plato wrote of Atlantis, he said he wasn't creating a fable, he was retelling an older Egyptian account. The Egyptians, in turn, said they were simply passing down what their ancestors had survived, a flood, the fall of a great civilization, a world reset. And stories like these, well, they're anything but rare. They're everywhere. From the drowned lands of Kumari Kandam in southern India to the flood legends of the Hopi and Maori, humanity keeps remembering something vast, something that changed everything. Could every culture on Earth have dreamed up the same story by coincidence? Maybe. Fear, awe, and imagination travel easily across time, but maybe our ancestors weren't imagining at all. Maybe they were remembering. Ice melting, seas rising, fire falling, comets blazing. They might have lived through global events that reshaped the world and passed down those memories in the only way they could. Through story, myth might be humanity's oldest hard drive. Instead of storing data in code or ink, it preserves it in symbols, rhythm, and metaphor. A flood story isn't just a moral lesson. It might be a memory of the last ice age, when oceans rose hundreds of feet, swallowing the coasts where ancient people once lived. The image of people on boats, animals saved in pairs, rain falling for endless days. Maybe that's not poetry. Maybe it's shorthand for survival. A compressed account of a catastrophe so massive that words alone couldn't capture it. And then there are the sky gods. Almost every culture speaks of beings who descended from above, sometimes bringing knowledge, sometimes creating humankind itself. The Sumerians had the Anunnaki. The Dogon people of Mali spoke of the Nomo, amphibious teachers from the star Sirius. The Maya described gods descending in radiant craft. Australia's Aboriginal peoples told of star ancestors who came down to shape the land. We usually interpret these as creation myths, religious symbols. But if myths are memories, maybe they're describing contact, not with extraterrestrials, but with survivors from an earlier world, people so advanced that to later hunter-gatherers they seemed divine. Imagine that. A handful of survivors carrying the last pieces of lost knowledge, navigation, astronomy, architecture, into a world that had forgotten. Imagine them teaching farming or stone shaping to people who had never dreamed of such things. Generations later, their names would fade and their deeds would turn into legend. The clues that remain are scattered. Ancient maps show coastlines that would have existed before the Ice Age ended. Megaliths around the world are aligned with the stars, built by cultures supposedly too primitive to understand such precision. Some myths describe stars invisible to the naked eye, or cosmic events that match astronomical records from tens of thousands of years earlier. None of this proves that a forgotten civilization once existed, but together, the pattern is hard to ignore. It doesn't look like pure fantasy. It looks like memory blurred by time. This idea isn't new. From Plato to Graham Hancock, from early explorers to modern researchers, people have searched for traces of a civilization that came before. Some point to the submerged ruins off India and Japan, structures now beneath the sea, in places that were dry land 12,000 years ago. Others look to the sudden appearance of agriculture, mathematics, and the shared star knowledge linking ancient cultures oceans apart. Each clue alone means little, but myths weave them together into something larger, a possibility. The most fascinating part might be how memory itself works. Human memory isn't perfect. It distorts, simplifies, transforms over generations. When oral traditions are passed through hundreds of storytellers, literal truth erodes, but the shape of the story endures. A flood becomes divine punishment. A lost island becomes a warning tale, yet beneath the symbolism, the core remains, like a fossil inside a stone. Modern neuroscience tells us that emotional events carve the deepest grooves in memory. Disasters, loss, change. So if humanity once lived through the fall of a great civilization, it makes sense that the trauma would survive, not as fact, but as myth. A warning wrapped in story. And maybe there's another reason myths endure. They explain what evidence can't. When people thousands of years ago found ruins or monoliths they couldn't build themselves, they filled the gap with wonder. These must have been made by gods, they said, or giants, or something greater than us. Maybe they were right, or maybe they were remembering people greater than themselves. Not supernatural, just gone. Some researchers even suggest our brains might be wired to preserve certain memories at a collective level. We recognize patterns in story, rhythm in repetition. We pass them on not just in words, but through rituals, art, and symbol. Maybe myth is a kind of long-term, intergenerational memory system, a cultural hard drive written in story form. If that's true, the stories we call myths might not be fiction at all. They might be the record of humanity itself, compressed, simplified, reinterpreted to survive forgetting. So when we hear of gods teaching writing, or cities destroyed by divine wrath, or people scattered by great floods, maybe we're hearing the faint echo of real history. Maybe myth is civilization talking in its sleep, half dreaming, half remembering. That idea is humbling. It means the distance between myth and memory isn't as wide as we think. Even in our earliest days, humans were capable of remembering across thousands of years, turning survival into story and story into identity. If that's true, then maybe the first civilization never truly vanished. Its monuments may have fallen, its knowledge scattered, but its voice endures, in words, in rhythm, in stories. Every time we tell a tale of creation or flood, of light and darkness, maybe we're repeating their final message. Because when everything else is lost, your cities, your tools, your language, stories remain spoken, sung, retold, until they become timeless. Maybe that's why these ancient stories still move us. Somewhere deep inside, we recognize them, not from books, but from the collective memory of our kind. They belong to the same mind that once looked up at the stars and saw home. And as we move forward, we'll follow those echoes, through floods that never truly ended, through stones that shouldn't exist, through symbols that might be messages from the past. We won't rush, we'll listen, because if myth is memory, then somewhere, long before history began, there was a moment when remembering became survival itself. Picture that world. No cities, no metal, no roads. The horizon was your calendar, the stars, your clock, the seasons, your teachers. Firelight flickered on faces as stories began, the ones that had to be told, so nothing learned would be lost. This wasn't civilization as we define it, no kings, no temples, no written records, but there was intelligence, language, and an understanding that knowledge could die, that awareness, that fragile spark of memory, is what built everything that came after. Our ancestors didn't have history books, but they had stories. And within those stories burned the first light of civilization. Archaeologists still find the traces, stone tools shaped with impossible care, burials arranged with ritual precision, cave paintings alive with motion and intent. They're proof that even then, humans weren't just surviving. They were thinking, imagining, remembering. The paintings at Lascaux, 17,000 years old, aren't the work of primitive minds. They're the work of artists. The animals on those walls run and breathe with meaning. They're not decoration, they're communication. In them, you can feel the bridge forming between instinct and intellect. They saw patterns in the world, the turning of the stars, the rhythm of the seasons, the paths of the herds. They understood the sky, and most importantly, they remembered. To remember across generations is its own kind of technology. Not a tool you can hold, but a framework of thought, a way of carrying knowledge forward through time. At some point, humans discovered that words could outlive them. They realized that memory, when spoken aloud, could be passed like a flame from one mind to another. And when that happened, myth became humanity's most powerful survival mechanism. Now imagine that this skill, this ability to encode experience in story, wasn't used only for hunting or weather or planting seasons. Imagine it was used for something far greater, to preserve the memory of an entire world. If there truly was a civilization before the one we know, Its survival would have depended on storytellers. If their cities sank or their mountains burned, someone would have needed to tell the children why, not in writing, but in images and emotion, in gods and floods, light and darkness, death and rebirth. Those stories would become the myths we still whisper. Around 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The earth began to thaw. The last ice age came to an end. Glaciers melted, and the seas rose with terrifying speed. Scientists call this period the Younger Dryas boundary, a time of violent climate swings, sudden floods, and global chaos. To the people who lived through it, it must have felt like the world itself was coming apart. Forests appeared where tundra had stretched for ages. Animals vanished or migrated to strange new lands. Entire coastlines were swallowed by the rising oceans. No wonder so many ancient myths speak of floods and destruction. Maybe they weren't metaphors at all. Maybe they were eyewitness accounts. What we call mythology might simply be humanity's way of processing the trauma of losing everything familiar. In that chaos, small groups of survivors would have clung to whatever stability they could find. And then, in modern-day Turkey, we find something remarkable. Göbekli Tepe. Massive stone circles carved with animals and symbols, built by people who, according to our history books, should still have been nomads. Some stones weigh tons. The site is over 11,000 years old, older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Mesopotamia. It's as if someone somewhere remembered how to build. Where did that knowledge come from? Why, after tens of thousands of years of simple tools and shelters, did humans suddenly begin raising monuments aligned with the stars? It's a question that still unsettles archaeologists. Maybe the builders of these ancient sites weren't inventing from nothing. Maybe they were rebuilding, piecing together the fragments of something older, something nearly lost. Across early mythologies, we hear the same echoes. Gods teaching architecture, farming, and astronomy, divine beings descending to guide humanity in the arts of civilization. But what happens if you strip away the divine language? What's left? Teachers, survivors, people who knew things others didn't. If an older civilization had collapsed, and a few of its members endured, this is exactly how their knowledge would return to the world, not as blueprints, but as stories, told and retold until those teachers became gods in memory. Picture those survivors wandering a scarred landscape, rivers swollen with meltwater, forests blackened by fire, the air heavy with ash. To the scattered tribes they met, they must have seemed otherworldly, bringers of lost arts, keepers of forgotten wisdom. And when they were gone, their memory remained, reshaped into myths of gods who taught humanity how to live. Fire itself may have been the first symbol of that memory. It's one of humanity's oldest companions, both dangerous and divine. It destroys, but it also preserves. It bakes clay, tempers metal, drives away the dark. For early humans, fire was a living border between safety and the unknown. It wasn't just warmth, it was imagination. Around its glow, people shared stories, sang songs, and remembered what had come before. The flame became a teacher, a companion, and perhaps a reminder of something far older. Anthropologists who study early fire myths notice a striking pattern. Across cultures, fire isn't discovered, it's given. It's stolen from the gods, gifted by a hero, or brought down from the sky. In Greek myth, Prometheus steals it from Olympus. In Polynesian legend, Maui tricks the goddess of fire. Among the Navajo, sacred beings send animals to retrieve it for humankind. Everywhere fire is not found, it's bestowed. That tiny detail may preserve an ancient truth, a memory of contact or of knowledge passed between distant groups, or perhaps of something rediscovered after long forgetting. If you think of fire as symbolic, the spark of understanding, then the myth of its gift might represent the moment when lost knowledge was reignited. The fire before history could mean not literal flame, but enlightenment returning after darkness. We know humans weren't the first creatures to use tools, but we were the first to use them to preserve memory. Stone, wood, pigment, and fire all became extensions of thought. By the time humans began farming and domesticating animals, they were already shaping the world with intention. They built shrines, painted celestial patterns, and buried their dead with meaning. These weren't the actions of instinct, they were the work of memory and foresight. It meant we weren't just living in time, we were thinking in it. So maybe the first civilization wasn't a single city or empire at all. Maybe it was a network, connected not by walls or borders, but by shared ideas. A civilization of thought, stretching across continents in the minds of people who carried fire and story wherever they went. Archaeology hints at this possibility. Stone tools in Africa and the Middle East share nearly identical designs, even though they're separated by thousands of miles. Cave art across Europe and Asia repeats the same symbols, spirals, dots, handprints, as if early humans spoke a universal visual language that doesn't prove direct contact, but it suggests a shared origin, a deep inheritance passed through generations, a kind of symbolic DNA. Even today, we see traces of it. The spiral appears everywhere, in Celtic carvings, Mayan temples, Aboriginal rock art, and Hindu yantras. It represents motion, energy, life, and rebirth, concepts older than philosophy itself. Could that really be coincidence? Or is it one of the last living remnants of an ancient system of meaning, a visual memory so old that we've forgotten where it began? Seen this way, history stops looking like a straight line. It looks more like a heartbeat, knowledge flaring up, fading out, then flaring again, like fire being rekindled from dying coals. The myth of a first civilization might not point to a lost Atlantis under the sea, but to a repeating pattern in the human story, the cycle of memory, loss, and rediscovery. Some researchers believe this cycle explains why civilizations seem to bloom so suddenly. Agriculture, writing, architecture, astronomy all appeared within a brief window after the Ice Age. Maybe that wasn't innovation. Maybe it was recollection, humanity remembering pieces of what it once knew. That's what myths do best. They rebuild. They fill the silence left by catastrophe. They let us reconstruct the outline of what was lost through stories that still echo its shape. Listen closely, and you can hear those echoes. The Sumerians told of kings ruling before the flood. The Egyptians remembered the Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth. The Maya spoke of worlds created and destroyed in cycles. The Greeks told of the ages of man, golden, silver, bronze, and iron, each one further from perfection. Maybe these weren't literal eras, but reflections of how civilization rises, falls, and rises again. To us, surrounded by digital archives and infinite storage, the idea of forgetting an entire world feels impossible. But in an age without writing, where memory lived only in people's minds, it wouldn't take much. A few generations of famine, flood, or war, and everything could vanish. What survived would be fragments, coded in story. Names would change, gods would take on new forms, but the memory, that core truth, would endure. It's possible that some pieces of that forgotten world survived, not as ruins or relics, but as knowledge. Practical wisdom passed quietly from one age to the next. Star maps, planting calendars, ratios used in architecture, things remembered long after their original meaning had been lost. We can still see traces of this today. Ancient structures aligned perfectly with solstices and equinoxes, myths that encode astronomical cycles, precession, eclipses, celestial movements far too precise to be random. Those aren't coincidences. They're evidence of memory, of people preserving information too complex to have happened by chance. Someone knew how to read the sky long before telescopes or math could explain it, and they taught it the only way they could, through story. Think of it this way. If you wanted to pass scientific knowledge forward 10,000 years, you couldn't rely on language. Words shift. Alphabets die. Civilizations vanish. But stories? They survive. You'd hide your knowledge inside them, in tales of gods and animals, in rituals that follow the rhythm of the seasons, in songs that children would remember long after the world had changed. That's exactly what our ancestors did. Myth wasn't primitive science. It was science built to last. Resilient knowledge disguised as story so it could survive the erosion of time. Maybe that's what the fire before history really was. Not a literal flame, but the spark of preservation. The birth of storytelling as a technology. Before there were words carved in clay or numbers etched into stone, humans invented something far greater: continuity. A way to carry understanding forward even when everything else fell apart. It's humbling to realize that every story we tell, every word that leaves our mouths, still carries a trace of that first fire, the same spark that kept the past alive long enough to become myth. And we're still doing it, passing the flame, through books, through screens, through voices carried softly into the night. If those ancient myths are truly memories, maybe what they remember isn't just lost cities or vanished empires, but the act of remembering itself. They remind us that civilization doesn't begin with walls or tools. It begins with the decision to keep the story going, even when the world goes dark. So as we move deeper into this journey, that's where we'll stay, close to the embers, watching as they glow brighter, revealing the faint outline of the world that once was, and the memory that refused to die. Water remembers. Not the way stone does. It doesn't hold shape or weight, but it moves. And in its movement, it carries traces of everything that came before. When the world warmed after the Ice Age, the water began to rise. Ice melted, rivers swelled, oceans crept inland, and everything our ancestors had built along those ancient shores vanished beneath the waves. Maybe what we call the Great Flood wasn't one single event, but a series of overlapping catastrophes, each one erasing another coastline, another generation's home. Every continent tells its version of that story. It isn't isolated the way creation myths are. It's everywhere. A global memory told in 1,000 different voices. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay thousands of years ago, speaks of a flood so vast that even the gods trembled. The story of Noah echoes it closely: a warning, a vessel, the saving of animals, a rebirth of the world. In Hindu texts, Vishnu warns Manu of an oncoming flood and instructs him to save life itself in a great boat. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived when Zeus drowned a corrupt world. The Chinese remembered Gun and Yu battling waters for decades. Across the Americas, the Hopi, Inca, and Pacific Northwest tribes told their own versions. Even in Australia, where deserts stretch for miles, Aboriginal stories speak of rising seas swallowing ancient coastal plains. You could call them parables, moral lessons about humility, destruction, and renewal. But when the same story repeats across every corner of the planet, when it carries the same bones, the same rhythm, it's hard not to wonder if it all began as memory, not imagination, not allegory, but something real. During the last ice age, much of Earth's water was locked in glaciers. When the planet began to warm, that ice had to melt, and the ocean rose more than 100 meters. Slowly at first, then in violent pulses as ice sheets collapsed. Scientists call them meltwater pulses, sudden surges when entire ice fields broke apart and poured into the sea in just a few years. 12,000 years ago, one of these floods might have raised global sea levels by several meters in a single lifetime. For people living on the coasts, that would have been the end of the world. Imagine it. You stand on the same shoreline your ancestors fished for generations, watching the tide creep closer each season. The sea takes the fields, then the forest, then the village. At first it's gradual, something you can adapt to. Then, one spring, the northern ice collapses. Rivers explode from their banks. Rain hammers down for days. The ground shakes. The horizon moves. You climb to higher ground, and when you look back, your world is gone. Those who survived told their children, and those children turned memory into story, water rising beyond measure, gods angry or grieving, a chosen few spared to begin again, boats, real or symbolic, built to preserve life itself, and over time those memories became myth, the flood that ended one world and began another. Modern science supports pieces of these memories. In the Black Sea region, researchers have found evidence of a massive flood around 7,600 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus and swallowed a freshwater valley, creating the Black Sea we know today. For those living there, it would have been apocalyptic. We see similar traces elsewhere. Underwater ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Bahamas, drowned riverbeds hundreds of meters below sea level, hints of settlements buried where oceans now roll. If we think of myth as a kind of long-term cultural memory, then these flood stories might be exactly that, records of a shared global trauma, each retold through the lens of survival and symbolism. Maybe the floods weren't just punishments or moral resets. Maybe they were warnings, stories left behind to remind us what happens when the balance between humanity and nature breaks. The flood myths often lead into another theme, the idea of a lost golden age. Nearly every culture remembers one, a time when life was easier, when humans lived in harmony with the world, when knowledge was abundant until something went wrong. The flood became the dividing line, the boundary between that world and ours. The moment the memory of the first civilization sank beneath the sea. When Plato wrote about Atlantis, he described an island nation beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a world rich in knowledge and power, destroyed in a single night of floods and earthquakes. He claimed it wasn't his invention, but a story passed down from the Egyptians, already ancient in his time. And the Egyptians, in turn, said they were only repeating what their own ancestors had told them, that worlds rise and fall, and each leaves echoes in the next. That same pattern appears in Sumerian tablets, Aztec codices, Polynesian chants. The world ends, the waters rise, a few survive, and humanity begins again. Maybe these aren't separate stories, but different fragments of the same event, the final disappearance of a forgotten world. When the seas rose, they didn't just drown cities, they erased maps, they erased evidence, they left us questions. Off the coast of India, divers discovered what might be the submerged ruins of Dwarka. Walls, steps, roads now buried beneath the Arabian Sea. Some evidence suggests people lived there over 9,000 years ago, long before any known civilization. Near Yonaguni, Japan, vast underwater terraces hint at similar mysteries. Are they natural formations, or the remains of a lost settlement? Scientists still debate it, but if they are human-made, they belong to a time when those lands were dry. Before the waters came even inland, the signs remain. In North America, the scablands of Washington state were carved by floods of unimaginable scale at the end of the Ice Age. In the Middle East, sudden flood layers mark ancient river valleys. Science tells us it wasn't one single world-ending flood, but a series of them, reshaping the planet again and again. For the people who lived through it, that distinction didn't matter. To them, it was the end of everything. And when we look at their flood stories through that lens, they stop feeling like moral allegories and start sounding like history remembered through emotion. Myths don't measure time in years or distance. They measure in impact, in how deeply something was felt. They carry the memory of confusion, of terror, of watching the familiar world swept away by forces beyond control. But they also carry something else, the spark that survived. Maybe that's why the story of the flood has never faded. It's more than an echo of history. It's a mirror for all human loss. Every generation faces its own flood, wars, plagues, disasters, and each time we retell the same story. The world ended, and we began again. That cycle of destruction and rebirth is the oldest pattern we know. But if there really was a first civilization, something capable of planting the same myth across continents, where did it exist? What did it look like before the waters came? Some researchers point toward the continental shelves now hidden beneath the sea, lands that once joined Britain to Europe, India to Southeast Asia, and Siberia to Alaska. Those areas, now drowned, would have been lush and full of life, perfect places for human settlement. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, those worlds vanished, taking their people and their knowledge with them. Many ancient myths describe lost islands beyond the edges of the known world, lands swallowed by the ocean, kingdoms beneath the waves. Maybe those weren't fantasies at all, but memories of real places that sank when the waters rose. To the survivors who fled inland, the sea itself would have become sacred, a grave of their past and the resting place of everything they loved. Those who escaped might have carried fragments of their knowledge, how to plant, how to build, how to chart the stars. Over generations, those fragments could have seeded new cultures, becoming the roots of civilizations that seem to appear out of nowhere, that changes how we see ourselves. It suggests that humanity didn't invent civilization, it remembered it. Our story isn't just one of progress, it's one of recovery, of rediscovery. Even today, that memory still flows through our language. We talk about starting fresh, washing away the old, cleansing renewal, all echoes of that same ancient flood. We don't need science to understand what rising water feels like. The fear of losing everything, the courage to rebuild, those are emotions older than any written word, and science, strangely enough, has started to meet myth halfway. Studies of ancient coastlines reveal traces of human life, tools, hearths, fishing camps, along shores that are now deep underwater. These discoveries don't prove a lost super-civilization, but they prove something real. People were there, living, thriving, long before the waters took their homes. When they moved inland, they carried their stories with them. Over time, the names of real places faded, replaced by symbols, an ark, a mountain, a god. The memories survived, translated into a language that could last. There's even a strange echo of this in genetics. Modern research shows that nearly all non-African humans descend from a small population that lived about 70,000 years ago, a bottleneck event that may have followed a massive natural disaster. In a mythic sense, that's a flood too. The world nearly erased, then reborn through a few survivors. We may not recall the details, but we remember the shape, the loss, the renewal, the beginning again. That's what myth preserves best. The flood isn't just about water, it's about what it means to be human, to face endings, to rebuild, to endure. Every civilization meets its own flood eventually. Empires fall, seas rise, time erases what once felt permanent. But someone always survives, someone always remembers, someone rebuilds. That's the heart of it. The true message carried by every flood myth. It's not the drowning that defines us, it's what comes after. The act of telling these stories is itself an ark, a vessel carrying fragments of the old world into the new. And as the waters finally recede in our imagination, we can almost glimpse what came before them. A world of builders and dreamers, of people who watched the skies and measured the earth long before we learned to do it again. Their memory lives on, in stones, in symbols, in stories. Next, we'll follow those traces, to the horizon where heaven and earth seem to touch. The realm of the old gods, the ones said to have descended from above, bringing with them the wisdom the flood could not erase. When the waters retreated and the world reshaped itself, the survivors must have seen a planet reborn, familiar yet strange. Forests crept across tundra, rivers carved new paths. To them, it must have felt like a second creation. They would have looked up at the same stars their ancestors once used to guide them, but now those constellations hung over a changed horizon. The earth had shifted, but the sky stayed the same, and maybe that's when humanity began looking upward, not just for direction, but for origin. In nearly every ancient myth, older than writing, older than cities, the gods come from above. They descend on beams of light, on clouds, or in fire. They bring knowledge, agriculture, writing, astronomy, the art of shaping stone. To the people watching, they were divine. To the storytellers who came later, they became symbols. But maybe, just maybe, they were memories. It makes sense that early humans saw the sky as the source of wisdom. The heavens were the only constant in a world that kept breaking and beginning again. The stars didn't drown. They didn't burn. They returned every night, steady and patient. Watching them gave rhythm to life. It turned chaos into pattern, time into something we could measure. Those who mastered that knowledge became something more. They were the keepers of time, the watchers of the sky. To others, they must have seemed almost godlike, and the myths remember them that way. In Sumer, the first civilization we know of, the Anunnaki were said to have descended from the heavens to teach humankind the skills of living, cultivation, measurement, and the shaping of metal. In Mesoamerica, the god Quetzalcoatl came from the sky bringing corn, numbers, and writing. In Egypt, Thoth gave the gift of language and mathematics, knowledge from the divine, and across the world the story repeats, different names, same pattern, same pulse. A reminder that maybe the gods were never just symbols after all. Maybe they were the echoes of teachers who came before the flood, whose lessons still whisper through the myths we tell tonight. In Polynesian tradition, the god Tangaroa descended from the heavens to shape the islands and teach people how to navigate using the stars. What's remarkable is that cultures separated by oceans and millennia, each isolated by geography, tell stories that echo the same tune. The similarities are too deliberate to feel like chance. Some scholars say it's simply human nature to project wisdom onto the divine, but others see something deeper. Perhaps these tales preserve a collective memory of real teachers, people who appeared suddenly, carrying knowledge far beyond what local tribes possessed. Imagine survivors from a fallen civilization emerging into a new primitive world. If they still remembered engineering, farming, or astronomy, those skills would seem like magic. To the small hunter-gatherer groups they met, they would have seemed like gods who came from the stars. And it isn't just their arrival that unites these stories, it's what they taught. Across continents, the so-called gods shared three essential gifts: how to grow food, how to measure the earth, and how to read the sky. These are the foundations of civilization, and they appeared with startling speed after the last ice age. Archaeologists tell us that within only a few thousand years, humanity across the globe independently developed agriculture, cities, and calendars. That's the official story. But what if it wasn't pure invention? What if it was remembrance, knowledge rediscovered rather than born from nothing? Maybe those sky gods weren't gods at all. Maybe they were human survivors, keepers of an older world's wisdom, spreading fragments of it to the ones rebuilding in the new. That would explain why the earliest monuments, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Mesoamerica, all reach upward. They aren't just tombs or shrines, they're messages in stone, architectural memories of a time when knowledge once descended from above. The precision of these ancient structures, often aligned perfectly with stars and solstices, suggests their builders weren't guessing. They were following designs older than their own cultures. Many of these sites served dual purposes. As temples and observatories, the Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, aligns within a fraction of a degree to the cardinal directions, and its layout mirrors Orion's belt. In Mexico, the Avenue of the Dead at Teotihuacan runs along a flawless astronomical axis. The entire city may have been designed as a cosmic map. At Stonehenge, the massive stones mark the sunrise at the summer solstice and the cycles of the moon. Even older still, the Nabta Playa stones in the Sahara align with the rising of specific stars. These patterns weren't accidents. They reveal a global obsession with the heavens, a shared discipline of sky-watching among cultures that supposedly had no contact. The question isn't whether they were astronomers, but where they learned such precise geometry and timing. You don't leap from crude stonework to the perfection of the Great Pyramid overnight. That kind of knowledge requires centuries of accumulation. Yet according to standard timelines, these societies advanced almost instantly. The leap makes more sense if we think of it as remembering, not inventing. If survivors of some catastrophe carried fragments of lost geometry, navigation, or star lore, they could have rebuilt what they remembered, passing it on to others. Over generations, those teachers would become legends, the sky gods, the builders, the keepers of maps. Their knowledge would transform into ritual, then religion, and finally, myth. To ancient people, the sky wasn't just a backdrop of light, it was order. It was permanence. Watching it meant predicting floods, planting crops, and sailing across endless oceans. Those who could read the stars seemed to hold the power of the world itself. It's no wonder so many ancient civilizations believed their gods lived among the stars and only descended to deliver wisdom. Perhaps those weren't divine beings at all, but travelers returning from far-off lands. Sailors, explorers, or the last descendants of an earlier civilization reuniting a scattered human family. What's even more intriguing is how these myths preserve real astronomical details. The ancient Egyptians worshipped Sirius, whose rising each year marked the flooding of the Nile. Thousands of miles away, the Dogon people of West Africa revered the same star, and their oral traditions contain astonishingly accurate information about its invisible companion long before telescopes existed. In the Americas, the Maya charted the movements of Venus with remarkable precision, tracking its cycles across centuries. Observation alone might explain part of this accuracy, but not all. It would have taken generations of meticulous record-keeping, guided by a system already in place, a system that may have been inherited. The same mystery extends to ancient maps. The Piri Reis map, drawn in the 16th century but sourced from much older charts, shows the coastlines of South America and Antarctica with surprising accuracy, including details hidden beneath ice long before recorded history. Some researchers believe that data came from far older maps, perhaps created by a civilization with seafaring capabilities long before the known age of exploration. Prehistoric navigation might sound impossible until you look at the evidence. The Polynesians crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific, using nothing but stars, waves, and bird patterns to find their way. Egyptians and Sumerians were sailing the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf thousands of years before formal trade routes existed. Artifacts, myths, and even genetic traces hint that distant cultures may have met long before our history books allow. If the first civilization truly existed, widespread or even global, its people may have been the original mapmakers, its legacy surviving not on parchment but in story. Many flood myths echo this same theme, survivors guided by stars to new lands after the waters fell. In Sumerian legend, Ziusudra, the Mesopotamian Noah, found safety when the gods revealed the constellations. In Polynesian lore, those who endured great storms followed star paths to islands that seemed to have been waiting for them. Even in the Hebrew tradition, the rainbow that appears after the flood can be seen as a symbol of the sky itself, a cosmic promise, the stars returning after endless rain. Taken together, these stories suggest something extraordinary, a continuous tradition of sky-watching and navigation far older than our written records, a wisdom that may have survived the flood, not in stone or scroll, but in the stars themselves. It also sheds light on why ancient civilizations built monuments that seem to unite earth and sky, stone and star. These people weren't simply worshipping the heavens, they were charting them. Those monuments may have been the earliest data records of a forgotten science, temples that served as observatories, calendars, and libraries carved in stone. What's truly fascinating is how the same constellations and myths reappear across the world. Orion, for example, shows up in Egyptian, Greek, Mayan, and Aboriginal stories, always as a hunter, a warrior, or a teacher. The Pleiades, a tiny cluster of stars, appear in tales from Japan to the Americas, often tied to creation or migration. These shared star patterns are like fingerprints left by the first astronomers, their meanings carried forward through countless generations. If those myths are memories, then they hold more than stories. They hold directions, reminders of how humanity once found its place in both time and space. The heavens became their library, a permanent archive when the earth itself was still shifting. After a world-changing catastrophe, looking up must have felt like an act of hope. The ground could move beneath their feet, but the stars remained constant. Watching them wasn't just science, it was survival. Maybe that's why so many ancient stories describe gods descending from the sky rather than rising from the ground. The sky represented wisdom that endured when everything else had been lost. But over time, that relationship shifted. As civilizations grew stronger, they no longer looked up in awe. They began to build upward. Instead, temples became towers. Observatories became monuments of pride. Yet even in their ambition, they carried echoes of the old world. They still aligned their structures with the heavens. They still wove geometry into every design. Even when the reason was forgotten, the habit remained. Myth quietly doing its job, preserving not just divine stories, but mathematics, proportions, and cosmic knowledge. When scientists study these sites today, they find repeating ratios, measurements that mirror planetary orbits, the Earth's tilt, or the precession of the equinoxes. It's as though the builders encoded the rhythm of the cosmos into stone, ensuring that celestial order would never fade from memory. That shared precision, repeating across continents and millennia, suggests that ancient knowledge didn't vanish. It survived in disguise. Myths of sky gods may have preserved the science of astronomy long after its origin was lost. The builders didn't just remember that the stars were sacred, they remembered how to measure them, how to translate them into architecture. And that raises the question, what kind of civilization could have begun such a tradition? Not one defined by machines or metals, but by patience, a culture with centuries to observe, to record, to teach, so that their knowledge could survive an age of darkness. A civilization not defined by its power, but by its continuity. Perhaps that's why we find their legacy not in ruins, but in stories. Words endure longer than stone, and in those stories, a single promise returns again and again. The sky gods would come back. Quetzalcoatl sails east, vowing to return when the world is ready. Osiris becomes a star, watching humanity from above. Even in Christian law, a teacher ascends to heaven with a promise to return. Maybe those weren't prophecies, but reminders, echoes of an ancient truth. Deep down, humanity might still be waiting for its teachers to return, the memory of that first knowledge coming back to us. When we look at our modern world, mapping the stars again, measuring the earth again, reaching for the heavens again, maybe we haven't surpassed our ancestors. Maybe we've simply remembered what they once knew. Progress, after all, might just be another word for remembering. The sky gods never truly left us. They survive not as deities, but as the lingering trace of those who once mapped both earth and heaven, the first mapmakers. They taught us how to look upward, and in doing so, how to find our place below. They left no written instructions, only alignments and myths, enough for us to find our way back when the time was right. And we are still following those maps, though we call them, by new names, satellites now trace the same orbits where the ancients placed their gods. Astronomers read the same stars, once studied by temple priests. The night sky that inspired sacred monuments now drives our technology. But the desire behind both remains the same, to understand where we come from and what came before. If that first civilization truly existed, its greatest achievement wasn't its monuments or inventions. It was its message. A way to speak across 10,000 years, encoded in starlight and story. And as we decode those messages, we begin to see what they were trying to preserve. A balance between earth and sky, knowledge and humility, memory and meaning. Perhaps their map still exists, not on paper or in ruins, but scattered across deserts, jungles, and oceans. Yet the greater map was never lost. It's still above us, the same sky they watched, the same silent teacher, and as the old myths fade into the modern night, their meaning grows clearer. The gods of the sky were once people of the earth. Remembering them is how we remember ourselves. The stars lifted their eyes, but the earth guided their hands. Somewhere between heaven and stone, humanity began to build. Not just for shelter, not for territory, but to remember. Across continents, from Egypt's sands to the jungles of Mesoamerica, from the Andean peaks to the valleys of Anatolia, we find the same mystery written in stone structures that defy explanation, shaped with precision that even today challenges us. They seem almost alive, as if the earth itself had been persuaded to take form. Whoever built them knew how to coax rock into order with a mastery we still struggle to match. Look closely, and every site whispers the same question: who built these and how? The weight of the stones, the flawless joins, the cosmic alignments, they hint at a memory far older than the civilizations themselves. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza. Each block weighs several tons, placed so precisely that even with modern cranes and lasers, we'd struggle to duplicate it. Its four sides align almost perfectly to true north. Off by only fractions of a degree more than a tomb, it's a monument of measurement, encoding ratios that mirror the Earth's own geometry. We call it Egyptian genius, and it was, but the builders themselves claimed their wisdom came from an earlier age,